Grandomania of an escape art. By Leon Qafzezi. While a fierce war was declared against art for art's sake, art flourished in the realist socialist country, but that in fact had nothing to do with it, because in reality, it was a grotesque reflection of an ideology based on its Grandomania syndrome. It started with the greatness of the leader, the creation of his artificial cult, and continued with the greatness of the party's works and ended with the collectivist reflection, which included the working class, youth and cooperative peasantry. It is about art in the great era of the Labour Party, means the great age of isolation, the great age of class warfare. Unfortunately, that time preserved medieval features, where apart from classical art, no other art had to be liked, reproduced, and especially modern art called reactionary art, bourgeois art, that had nothing to do with the dictatorship of the proletariat. This was common to all kinds of art and literature. It was not just myopia, it was a large ghetto with barbed wire, which forcibly included the artistic thought of the Albanian intelligence. Not only was it not allowed to create free art according to the individual inspiration and specific tastes of artists of the respective genders, but they were deprived of and strictly forbidden from viewing modern art albums. This was punishable by law. We know of many cases where artists have been imprisoned for imitating a modern work, for daring to come up with a new idea, which is considered hostile because it was not on the party line. They were even shot for a poem, a rare case in the Balkan dictatorships, because from the investigation, the poem turned out to have allusions against the popular power. Looking at that time from today, it seems more comic than tragic, but in fact it was more tragic, not just for the creator who was unjustly convicted and did not even have a defense lawyer, but was generally restraining and suffocating for everyone, and Albanian art in particular. How could art develop in the conditions of a complete lack of freedom? Art requires not only freedom, but also inspiration that comes from the former. A well-known foreign poet has said that you cannot write poetry with a revolver in your head, because poetry, or any other art, is not done under pressure, ideological violence, pedantry. It requires inspiration, artistic in true creativity, which is conditioned by the freedom of art and dependent, among other things, on the muse. Muse, it was interpreted when it was sincere as a bourgeois sign and was a very dangerous precedent for the personality of the artist, writer, playwright, filmmaker. Then, under this political and ideological pressure, artists were forced to create an art that they conceived as inside the logic of censorship, and especially self-censorship that eroded them like acid from within the soul, thirsty for true art. Then, under the shadow of the art of socialist realism, Grandomania in works of art began to take shape. In painting, as in compositions or even portraits, large limbs dominated, in Baptiste figures. Partisans with large hands to leave the symbolic impression that with those giant hands they had strangled the external enemy or the enemy of the class. Giant fists, giant openings, alienated rifles and machine guns, portraits with large heads that resembled fleece. The symbolism with which they began to disguise their art was very grotesque, but also very justifiable for the time. Majesty pleased the ruling megalomaniac party. With this kind of art she felt flattered, confident in longevity. This was also the case in literature. The poems to the party and the leaders were merely inflated praises and seldom had in themselves any slight artistic find. This also happened with music. The magnificent theme of the party dominated. The heroic theme, the illustration of an isolated life in an ideological cage, was treated with powerful nuances of freedom. Monumentalism was liked in sculpture, but still in this type of art. The artist had more opportunities to speculate through the voluminous mass contained in this type of art. That is why in sculpture we have works of art many times more accomplished in form than in many other arts. In cinematography and theater, it was the greatest danger of slipping. Especially when the themes for the film or scene were in the film or the drama of the time, so they had to reflect actuality. In them, schemes and artifices dominated, and the conflicts were almost false in their dramaturgical form. That suddenly the party secretary appeared, who with his Bolshevik political formation resolved the conflicts like a magic wand. And they ended with a happy ending. It is known how many writers, playwrights, directors have been persecuted, exiled or imprisoned by a misinterpretation that the party leadership made of drama or film. There were even flagrant and scandalous cases when the leadership itself liked it and applauded it at the premiere, but the next day the presence of the leader of the political bureau categorically rejected the act as an anti-party act and threw the author himself in prison or exile. Then it was said, not without any irony, Mehmet liked it but Enver rejected it. In general, all Albanian art, like all Albanian life in Albania, was not only isolated but also surveyed. This penetrated the family, the artist and even the common people who tried to live honestly. The depersonalization of the artist was on such a high scale that it could be compared to the darkest period of the Middle Ages. The artist was considered by the government as a person without personality, simply a helper of the party, a lever to further the propaganda of the party and its ideology. In short, a screw of the source. This conception of art, the so-called benefit of the masses, led very quickly not only to the humiliation and persecution of artists, but also to the deviation of the artistic characters of creators by transforming them into ordinary craftsmen, servile, flatterers and kisses of the regime, and were exactly these. Not forgetting the provocateurs and artists, for sure, who were decorated with important awards for the time and enjoyed benefits compared to other artists who did not flirt with the regime, but tried to make art within that ideological framework. The real tragedy was that the great drama that the Albanian people were actually going through in the first place, and then the Albanian art, was that it was being played with the fake currency, as if it were real. So an isolated country and one of the most backward in Europe, was inflated with some parades and masquerade manifestations, advertising and boasting about weapons stock forgiven by sisters who were later called revisionists and enemies, which had created a duplicate standardization a la Chinese, was shamelessly held as a shining beacon on the Adriatic, where paradoxically the whole of Europe had to take as an example, and why not learn lessons from the socialist way of life in Albania inspired by the teachings of Marxism, victorious Leninism? In all this amalgam of falsity, magnificent facade of the lie erected in the system, the funniest were the art critics, who criticized and stigmatized Western art and culture with all the low jargon of the Albanian vocabulary, without knowing it, who. But the beauty was that they did not know that culture and art because it was banned, and those books that came from the East to the National Library came from the Soviet Union. And most of them were stocks. They were read by the children of the political bureau and then circulated secretly hand in hand to friends and acquaintances of the family and loyalists. In reality, This is how many foreign authors such as Sartre, Camus, Kafka, etc. have secretly circulated, in addition to some foreign authors allowed to be seen as not dangerous for the regime, such as Leon Tolstoy, Maxim Gorky, Vladimir Mayakovsky, Jack London, John Steinbeck, M. Remarque, etc. and Nobel Prize-winning authors were strictly forbidden. They came into circulation much later there from 1981 as Asturias. Albums with painters like Arjpan, Ivazovsky were circulating. Pacific authors like Don Passos, etc. were seen as more dangerous. Artistic life in Albania had returned to the years of protracted dictatorship like a carousel with old rusty toys, where people revolved around this Disneyland, always around themselves without going anywhere, in search of vital toll, but without forgetting that there was in the center of the great sun the mother party that had darkened her life for almost 50 years and that had left her as a trust that this blinding enlightenment for the people to continue in the next years of democracy with the same intensity of care. It was a trust that should not be forgotten. We recommend